But what hasn't changed is or what shouldn't have changed is that mentality of the implementation. It's still a significant change, changing any system. It's almost the last resort. And ultimately, technology is there to support it. Technology is not going to change anything per se. It's the business objectives that have to be very, very clear.
The gas journey was pretty much straightforward. Now, the gas comes with a very different set of evolving expectations.
Who is your guest? And until you start to understand your guest, and who is that? Who is the target? Who would you like to be through the doors? Who resonates with your brand? Only at those points are you able to then really start considering how that guest journey is. I like to know that brands know who I am, know that I've stayed before, but there's so many luxury operators that aren't doing that. There's so many mid-market, and sort of four-star properties. They're nowhere near that yet. But for me, these will removing friction from that journey and just build that loyalty. Focus on the business outcome. It has to be, it's foundational. What is it there to do? And how are you going to measure that return?
Hello and welcome to Straight Talking by Focus on Hospitality. I'm Alessandra Leoni, your host for today, but I'm also an operator at heart, starting across every side of operation all the way to commercial leadership. And I'm now the head of hospitality for Focus on Hospitality for Focus Group. Today, I want to start with something I suspect every operator in this audience has felt at least once. You invest in a new system, you go through the implementation, you train the team, and then 6 months later, you are sitting in a review meeting wondering where the value actually went. The technology did not deliver what it promised, or perhaps it delivered exactly what it promised, and the problem was that nobody asked the right question before the contract was signed. Joining me today is Kevin Edwards, founder and CEO of Hospitality Technology Advisory, one of the most respected independent voices in hospitality technology. Kevin has sat on both sides of this conversation, both advising operator on what to buy and advising the industry on what to build. Kevin, welcome to our episode today, and please, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Alessandra. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. We love to get out and speak whenever we can. So yes, as you've said, Hospitality Technology Advisory, we work with myriad of different organizations within the sector, from limited service through to ultra luxury. So we really get to see it from every sort of facet, in terms of how technology impacts us. And I think crucially, our role, whilst we have technology in the title, it goes way beyond technology. Technology is just one part of it. I think understanding how operationally systems are going to work is such a critical part, which often is overlooked in the process. So for us, it's marrying, the operations, the technology, but also the commercial outcomes. And I think a lot of what we're going to talk today around is actually how do you measure that, and how do you actually make sure that those returns that you put so much time and investment into systems, that it actually gives real benefit to the operator. So yeah.
Great. So should we dive straight into my multiple questions? The first one for me is that there has been a lot of technology, investment in technology in hospitality, and that investment has grown enormously over the past decade, especially pre-COVID and post-COVID. From your position and as independent advisor, what has generally changed and what has stayed stubbornly the same?
Thanks. Yeah. So it's quite interesting because there's a number of different parties involved when it comes to acquiring new technology, and I think if we look beyond the hospitality industry and you look to the wider world, technology is now seen as such a simplistic thing to implement. We look at our consumer technology and it's frictionless. You open, your MacBook and it just opens and it works. There's so much ease with it. And so that almost sort of seeps into our conscious minds when we're making technology decisions. And often what we see is operators coming forward and saying, we need a new spa system, for example. And the thought and sort of the work that's required to make sure that, one, you're selecting the right technology, two, you're focused on what the outcome should be, are sometimes gone by the wayside as to, there's almost a mentality of, well, this should be simple. You've got the technology vendors coming and saying, you can have this running in a week. And from a technology point of view, you can. However, it's that implementation, it's the onboarding of the operation, not just to get the technology live, but what happens after. Recently worked with a group where, you've got sort of 10 hotels where, they're all operating slightly differently to each other. And they look to bring a new system in and we work with them. And it's fine to sort of consolidate ways of working, processes, all of those things in communication. But what happens after? What happens in 3 months? Who's going to ensure that that system is still being used the way it was designed? Because, as you know, Alessandra, from your days within the operator, that you get to the point where people start finding different ways of working and sort of manual workarounds. And for us, when advising clients, it's not just about the acquisition; it's about the ongoing. It's about how does this live in your organization? How do you culturally, change to embrace the opportunity that new systems can bring? So, I think in terms of going to the question of what's changed. I think that the messaging from a lot of the software vendors is this is really simple. It's turnkey. It's got all of the integrations that you require. And so there's almost creating this sort of belief that implementation is really simple. So we don't need to dedicate as much as what we used to.
But from a perspective, if I go back 20 years, installing a new PMS, for example, used to be hard work, and the implementation was not simple at all. When you look at one of the costs that was involved, two, how you are organizing, how you want the system to be structured and to be set up, and what processes you want to deliver through the new system. So from a cost perspective, was a considerable expense. When you fast forward to today, the same PMS installation is considerably faster, most cost effective, but the problem doesn't change. How are you going to use it long term for how it's intended to be, and how is the team going to embed it within the operation long term?
Yes. And to a certain degree, the things that have changed is that the technology has evolved. Systems are far more open than they've ever been. To be able to connect, your revenue management system or, your sales and event management system into your PMS has become, infinitely simpler than what it was. If we think, 20 years ago, you had all of these interfaces and you had on-site PCs managing. There was a lot of technical complexity. And I'm really pleased to say that a lot of that has been eliminated. But what hasn't changed is or what shouldn't have changed is that mentality of the implementation. It's still a significant change, changing any system. It's almost the last resort. You've really got to understand why you're changing, but also thinking about how are you going to manage that change? Who's going to project manage it? Who's going to write updated SOPs? These things can be overlooked in so many instances, but they're the bedrock of successful implementations.
And do you think that hospitality has reached a point where technology is generally viewed as a strategic business investment, or is still too often treated as a necessary cost to manage down?
Yeah, I think this is it's very much depending on the operator viewpoint. As I said, we work with a whole range of different organizations, and you tend to find the more traditional, organizations that have been in existence for many, many decades, they're still not treating it quite as strategically as what they could. Whereas, if you look at some of the more up and coming brands or the newer brands to the block, and people like Citizen M, sort of led that charge really. And now there's so many organizations that aspire to be like Citizen M. And their approach to technology is how can we leverage technology to, not just drive down bottom line costs. And when I say that, I don't mean just the cost of the technology, but actually the operational, how do we reduce our operational costs? But also they're looking at how it can generate revenue. How can we actually leverage increased revenues as a result of implementing systems, whether that be guest experience or whether that be, customer web journey, all of those things. So there's still a real mix of people within the sector, which have got differing views. It is changing, but it's taking time.
Okay. And when an operator comes to you and says they need to modernize their technology, the first question they almost always ask is, which system should we buy? Would you say that is the wrong question entirely?
Absolutely. And it is without doubt the most common question that we get, or almost statement that, we feel we need to modernize what we're doing. We don't feel it's progressive enough, or, it doesn't, relate to our brand. And for us, the question comes back to, what are the objectives? From a business point of view, what are your key business objectives and the initiatives that are required to support that? Is it, you're looking to grow in terms of revenue, or are you looking at how you can actually, slimline the operation? You look for staffing efficiencies. It has to start with a business statement or problem. And ultimately, technology is there to support it. Technology is not going to change anything per se. It's the business objectives that have to be very, very clear. And that's typically how we engage. We often find that if a business doesn't articulate it like that, then we will struggle to add value. We have to bring it back to the business. Technology is just a function that supports the business.
And also, not every operation runs the same as another in hospitality. You got different brands, you got different identities, different way of operating, and different strategies altogether. So what can work for one doesn't necessarily work for the other. So you and I had these conversations many times in previous lives. So how difficult it is to get the owner, the GM, the operator to align with the right approach to the modernization process?
Again, it comes back to that previous point. What's the purpose? What are we trying to achieve? And one size never fits all. For decades there's been almost a herd mentality that sits within there, which is, I go back and always refer to, you never get fired for buying IBM, and much the same when we look at the PMS landscape, for example. People almost default to Opera to say, well, that's the right answer now, and you're almost now thinking the questions to support the answer. And so for us, every organization is different, and that can be, two resort businesses, which are very, very different. One might be heavily on, events. One might be very heavily on, spa and wellness. So I think each individual business, and that's our approach, is about understanding what the key drivers are, to then find the right technology that can support them.
Kevin, if we go back some time ago, the guest journey was pretty much straightforward. Now, the guests come with a very different set of evolving expectation, and the choice that they make when they select the accommodation really relies to the brand and what information about the brand is made available either by the owner or the brand itself in terms of their comms, or what AI has ingested and has spit out back to the guest once they're making their choice. So how does the guest journey fits with the modernization process when it's evolving so fast and so much?
Yes, no, it's a good point, and I think this comes, it's almost a question which goes beyond, way beyond technology, and almost goes back to, brand strategy in terms of, well, who is your guest? And until you start to understand your guest, and who is that, who is the target? Who would you like to be through the doors? Who resonates with your brand? Only at those points are you able to then really start considering how that guest journey is. And I think what we see more and more particularly with properties that have got quite complex offerings. They might there might be rooms, spa, F&B might be a heavy reliance, and so those guest journeys are different in every case. So having just one standard guest journey is no longer sufficient. We have to consider that we have multiple journeys for different people. Some people, even within that luxury, ultra luxury space, want to be entirely digital. They live busy lives. So why do we assume that they want to have this great engagement at the front desk? Some do, don't get me wrong, but some don't. Some want to receive their key as they're in the chauffeur-driven car to the property.
We live in a moment in time where there are so many different generational elements to the guest. We are no longer talking about personas, but we're talking about generation, and we have so many generations traveling and staying within hospitality venues or spas or restaurant at the same time. So how that affects the technology and that you provide, that, like you said, it needs to be simple, it needs to be frictionless.
Yeah, and I think some of this is really ensuring that you've got great insights about who your guests are, and I think as we've sort of, if we go back to the point made earlier about, very siloed systems, and systems not talking to each other. For us, where we see real value has been the emergence of, customer data platforms, for example, which have been prevalent within retail and e-commerce for decades, and what they have is such a great wealth of data about their guests, their preferences, that really hospitality is in catch up, to be able to get to that point of really understanding how they deliver something quite unique to each and every guest. And particularly within the luxury sector, that's a given. The competition, particularly within luxury, is getting more and more fierce. We sort of see that middle part of the market of, traditional 4-star, full service hotels. A sort, part of that business is pushing down into, quite a digital limited service product. And the rest is pushing up into sort of, lower luxury and upscale. So, how do you make sure that you're still competitive within those sectors is really, really important.
And obviously competition and understanding the guest and make sure that it's part of the business outcome or the financial delivery. So how important it is to define those business outcomes, not necessarily, like you said, the technology requirement before selecting vendors, and how do you actually do that in an hospitality context?
Yes, I think some of this comes down to, really making sure you've got those objectives clearly defined, and how are you going to measure them? The measurement of return is something which should be in every single technology project that goes into existence, and is often overlooked, because it's difficult. It's not simple. If you're looking at how you increase customer satisfaction or employee engagement, these things are absolutely pivotal, because they're the fine lines that really elevate one brand to another. And so actually spending that time investing into understanding truly how is this going to deliver, and not only how is it going to deliver, how are we going to monitor that delivery is absolutely crucial. For me, having worked, over many decades with, private equity, for example, they come in with a very short-term view, often. And their focus on those returns is phenomenal, but actually it always delivers. And so they put the hard yards in early on to make sure that they've got a way of accounting for those returns.
Okay. And obviously, when a guest is satisfied or a business has met his expectation, there is a financial return. But sometimes when you lay out the project and what to change, it's very difficult to allocate that return on that investment. So obviously in hospitality we got our standard KPIs, whether they come from STR in terms of RGI or MPI and ARI, but ultimately they all lead to a revenue uplift
Yes.
or a cost savings that determines an increase in profitability. So how accurately and how often are businesses going back to actually measure what they are achieving, and how are you setting those expectations to measure post-project implementation and delivery?
Yeah, it is a difficult subject. Don't get me wrong, and I just sort of alluded to it there. But we have a number of different dynamics when it comes to hospitality. We're heavily driven and impacted by macroeconomic events. And so we see things like the unrest in the Middle East currently, and that has a huge impact not just on the Middle East but on wider markets. In terms of travelers, and so if you've got system implementations that have gone on during that process, then actually, are you now rebasing how you should be, because suddenly, figures could be subdued as a result. And so you could be construed that that's not delivering a return. And I think this, there's not an exact science to it. However, I feel that putting the time and investment into making sure that you know how you're going to look at those returns is key. But you also have to allow for changes to the business.
And is there a cost of doing nothing?
Absolutely. I've spoken about some of the more emerging brands that are coming within the sector. There's some real hunger and appetite. From a hotel ownership point of view, investment coming in is huge, and they're seeing this as a great opportunity to disrupt. Citizen M arguably were one of the first that sort of disrupted the model. But now, if you look at brands like Bob W, Numa, that are really, really going for this lean type organization, it's having huge impact because, suddenly they can compete on, what their cost of, per available room is, and what they're providing, and even when you sort of go up into that luxury space, guests are often not making the decision based on how much a room is. It's about that emotional connection to the brand in which they're staying. And so for me, that has to live throughout the whole organization, and technology has to enable that. And so not doing anything, inevitably is going to see business being eroded. There's more and more competition in every area where we see.
Okay. There is a lot of enthusiasm in hospitality right now about, shall I say it, AI, guest-facing apps, and automation, but much less conversation about the underlying infrastructure, connectivity, network, security, and resilience. Why do the foundations still get underinvested compared to...
I think sometimes it's an educational piece, particularly within the senior teams within hotel organizations. AI is so accessible to everyone that they almost see no barrier to entry. And what nobody really focuses back on is, okay, well, this all great AI platforms rely on data, they rely on connectivity, and security around all of it is so important. We talked before about how competitive a landscape we're talking, and what you don't want to do is to go headlong into some level of generative AI and end up in a sea of sameness in terms of your messaging, and ensuring that you're meeting your tone of voice, that your visual representation of your brand is represented and is true to who you are, is something which hospitality organizations have invested millions in over the years. And AI has a real danger of really undermining some of that investment by creating something quite generic, particularly when it comes to generative. I think that for me, the organizations that are really harnessing and leveraging the opportunity that AI produces are looking at the business cases, but also they're looking at it from an analytical data point of view, as opposed to, what can we turn around quickly? Inevitably, AI will drive efficiencies within our organizations, whether that's, operational, marketing content, or whatever it may be. However, without the core infrastructure in place, every organization is really going to struggle to leverage that. And that can be down to, even, considering things like SharePoint, in terms of actually, well, where does all of your data sit? Do you have that secure? How do you know you're not going to have documents in different places, which could suddenly start diluting that output? So it's really key, and something which we really try to ensure that senior teams understand that, investing in AI is also investing into the wider technology infrastructure.
Absolutely. And we're having lots of conversation. I personally, we have people coming to us, we need AI. And that's such a broad statement that is kind of a recipe for failure in a way. Why? What are you trying to do? It goes back to what problem are you trying to solve?
Absolutely.
And what efficiency are you trying to make with your business to, one, leverage the cost pressures that is manifesting at such an accelerating pace, and the staffing and recruitment drive are proving so much more difficult than they were
Yes.
a decade ago. So how do we balance that? AI seems the logical answer, but if it's not done correctly with the right strategy and approach, then it is absolutely extremely dangerous. And how do you prevent people using certain tools that are free and available and leaking some very valuable data
Yes.
that is proprietary to the business, to the brand, to the financial outcomes, if it's not governed correctly. So there is a lot of gray area at the moment, I find.
It is a grey area because businesses are letting it be a grey area. For us, for me, and you're too young to remember, Ali, I'm sure, but the days when the internet came around, and suddenly,
Remember.
I'm sure you don't. We got into this position where suddenly the technology was really accessible. Everyone could get on the internet, and you'd have people sitting there during the day doing their shopping, booking their holidays, and suddenly that's not good for productivity. And AI is no different. The one thing which happened after the internet really was introduced into mainstream businesses was suddenly we realized, well, we need to put policies in place. We need to tell people what they can and can't do. And bizarrely, we've learnt very few lessons in some cases. For us, when we start talking about AI to organizations, it starts with policy. Well, actually, what are your employees allowed to do, and what are they not allowed to do? And that comes now down to the next layer of data classification. Well, what data can they share with it? Is it secure? All of these questions, and it's having that AI framework in place. Without it, there is so much commercial risk in terms of, divulging sensitive information that ultimately all of these AI models are looking to harvest and train from. I think, that's been probably the biggest journey is understanding, let's not, suffer from, the fear of missing out. Let's really concentrate on why we're doing something. What is the business case for it? But also get those foundations in place. It's absolutely crucial.
And you think after everything that we've learned in hospitality over the past 20 years with system, we have had successes, there has been failures, there has been disruptor in the marketplace. Do you think that hospitality as business can realistically deliver a great team experience and guest experience if the core infrastructure or these questions are not asked or the systems are not fit for purpose? And how do you make the case to an owner who just wants to talk about the guest facing shiny new tech?
Absolutely. It's for me, I've gone on this journey with two groups recently where it's it's centered around food and beverage, in terms of their outlets. How do you get this vast amounts of data that we currently have on our guests into the hands of the people that are actually interacting with them, to make that that personal experience. And it's phenomenal because most technology companies, they go out and they design software and, they sit behind banks of computer screens and, they talk to people. And actually it's when you get on the floor and you see, you walk into a great restaurant and, the front of house, they welcome you and then you sat down. And if you look at the technology footprint within a restaurant, it's a pen and paper. So how do you get that information to somebody that's got a pen and paper? It's those problems that we need to overcome. And that's the infrastructure piece. How do you ensure that, if we have, mobile devices, that you've got great Wi-Fi? Without it, suddenly you're flying blind again. You're back to the pen and paper. So, it's putting the investment into, a system is one thing. Leveraging its use case is absolutely where there needs to be focus. And that goes back to the very start point, doesn't it? In terms of actually understanding how is this system going to exist within our organization? How do we leverage the benefits? And there's so much opportunity, but it requires investment. And that's why, we see the software vendors coming out and promoting their softwares, which is great. However, we need to consider the full investment that's required. Every time.
Absolutely. So over the past year, there hasn't been a single event or forum or networking opportunity or conference at the moment where AI has not been the dominant conversation. And I find myself split in two opposite sides because some of what I'm seeing is generally transformative if it's done the right way with the right strategy in mind, in the way it's changing the guest communication, in the way it can really enable the team to deliver that genuine and thoughtful hospitality. Also, alongside some of the revenue management tools that bolstered by AI can deliver at a very fast pace, but some they really feel like it's just noise and it's just the new bullet. So let's try to separate the two. Where do you think AI generally creates value for hospitality operators today? Not in theory, not in a pilot program, but in real operational practice at the moment.
Yeah, I think operational practice is very difficult. And it depends, I guess, in terms of the positioning of the property and of the brand where that sits. Within that luxury space, everything's personal. It's got to feel personal. In most cases, and so for me, we see that being quite light touch. AI within the operation within luxury, is quite limited. Particularly for front facing. We can build it to generate, for example, even, we don't want to go into the world of chatbots into luxury, but actually, giving sort of prompts to users about what they might want to say, even getting, a synopsis of a guest, something really simple, those real simple things make the biggest difference. It's an evolution that we've got to go through. Trying to, do it as a revolution is going to fundamentally hurt our business, and it's going to require a lot of investment and a retraining of staff. And so there's real risk attached with, trying to overly embrace AI. That said, there's some great use cases which sit around the data, in terms of understanding, predictive analysis, when we start, forecasting, revenue, maybe even in the F&B, where you start to consider, well, what's the impact of, geopolitical events, weather, what's the impact of local events, those smaller niche events, which maybe some of those revenue management systems don't have visibility of. Understanding that, which can inform us on what we expect our revenues to be, which then flows down into inventory management, staffing management, all of those things.
Okay. And what do you think businesses are chasing AI primarily because they feel they should? Everyone is telling them that you're going to be left behind if you don't, or because a vendor has convinced them that they need to?
Yes, I think the vendors are doing an incredible job of really putting that fear, uncertainty, and doubt into many hoteliers, feeling that they are being left out. What we've seen more and more in engaging with so many different brands is that journey is slow. AI requires investment. It requires structure. It requires that framework we've talked about. And actually, once you get involved and start speaking to them in terms of where people are on their AI journey, many have had their fingers burnt by going too soon, and realizing that technology is already outdated by the time they get it live. But many are actually still standing there, scratching their head saying, actually, how do we leverage value? And again, it comes back to, it's like any other technology decision. What's the business case for doing so?
So, Kevin, technology should not be the hero of the story here. For me, as an hotelier at heart, it should always be the guest, should always be the team. So, what role then, other than supporting the business, is there an ulterior motive for technology where it can support the guests and the team, be the hero in this story?
Yeah, no, that's it. I think technology has been has had many challenges over the years. We think about some of the technology deployments we saw in late 90s, early 2000s. Which were heavily centered on trying to fulfill everything that the guest would want. Having in-room technology that almost was what people were bringing with them. Accessibility to technology for guests, is totally transformed. We now have everything we want. We bring all of our own content, to be able to view on the screens if we choose to do so. We have the ability to call, Ubers, and ride sharing. So, guests, lives are absolutely immersed in their own technology. What hotels really need to focus on is how do they enable the guest to be able to use it, and that's giving them, a great, connectivity experience, something that's seamless, removing friction. How do I watch my own content on the big screen without that, the difficulty that often is associated. I've challenged with it many times when I've stayed away. And, for me, the more simplistic and the more intuitive we make our systems is absolutely key. If we think about, those great, experiences that you have with technology. You think when you get an iPhone and you get a new iPhone, you set it up and it's so simple. You don't need the IT department to do that, and transfer all of your data and all your it just happens. And that same passion and thought needs to go into, guest-facing technology. How does it, somebody walks into a room and actually just know how to use things? It should just be seamless.
But that is a basic element that has elevated the guest expectation. If it's so simple for a new phone to know all my history and transfer all the data, when I turn up at the hotel where I stay every other week,
Yes.
why they ask me the first time I stayed with them?
Ah.
So the guest doesn't care. I keep having conversation with GMs. Like, the guest doesn't care whether you use Opera or another PMS. They care that they are recognized and you ask questions that are relevant to them and what their intended journey is expected to be.
Yeah.
So to me, the success is where the technology is invisible.
Absolutely.
It just delivers.
Yes.
So with that in mind, what do you think the perfect hotel will look like into 2030? Which is just a short.
It's
short
not far
few
away.
years,
It's,
but
if we're not planning for it now, it's not going to happen. For me, having experienced so many different brands, the one thing which really resonates with me is feeling seen, feeling heard, is being recognized, and in quite a discreet way. I'm quite a private person. But I like to know that brands, know who I am, know that I've stayed before. I recently stayed at Dakota up in Newcastle, and I'd stayed a couple of months previous, and I turned up this Friday night and went and checked in, and immediately it was like, oh, welcome back, Mr. Edwards, which is phenomenal. But that's because they've got their system choices right. They can see that I'm a returning guest. There's so many systems that aren't showing that, or the this front desk operator's got so many screens they're trying to manage between to be able to see guest data here of what's my likes, what's my preferences, and what's my stay history. And to me, it's making sure you can get the right information to the right person, within the right application, absolute default, and that's a success. I see going beyond that as well. One thing that really irks me, if I'm staying, particularly if it's upscale or luxury, is that you deliver this perfect, beautiful sort of guest experience in terms of from a human element. They recognize you. Oh, Mr. Edwards, wonderful to see you. You sort of expect that within luxury, and then you go into a digital piece and you log on to the Wi-Fi and they don't know you. And that's such a simple thing that we should overcome. And it's, it goes beyond getting into the room and saying, welcome, Mr. Edwards. I want to be connected to my television so it becomes seamless that I can just airplay, my content. Things like that really make it a huge, huge difference. And I think, as travelers and people's lives become, more and more busy, they want those things to just be done as standard. Whether that's down to, being able to access their room key, on their mobile phone, the announcement recently around, Premier Inn, doing that, we look at Premier Inn as a brand and, in sort of the economy space, and you think, okay, that's marvelous. But there's so many luxury operators that aren't doing that. There's so many, mid-market, and sort of four-star property. They're nowhere near that yet. But for me, these will removing friction from that journey and just build that loyalty.
Absolutely. So let's go back to technology projects for a minute. In hospitality, they fail more than they succeed, perhaps, or at least they have failed more than succeeded over the past few years. Is it often because of people rather than technology itself? And who actually needs to be in the room when these projects are designed and agreed?
Yes. Well, again, it depends on the scale of the operation which you're talking about. If we're talking about a single property, having the users, the end users, the people that are actually going to use the system involved in that selection process is so key, in terms of understanding, well, what are the requirements? What do we need to do? It's way beyond technology, people. If the head of IT is in that room, that's just one aspect. It's the technical aspect. And in my eyes, that transition of why do projects fail, I think historically there were a lot of technical challenges that presented themselves. But now it's about people. It's about people and it's about change. And how do you manage this change? And that's typically where we see projects either falling down or maybe just not actually meeting the expectation of what the objectives were.
Okay. And how should hospitality business actually measure that technology ROI? Because I think many organizations are still managing things incorrectly. And you mentioned that earlier, setting the right measure from the beginning. So what you actually finding, if they're measuring, are they going about the wrong way? Is there a right way that you want to recommend to our audience?
Yeah, no, I think it's about that stakeholder engagement. Systems which are deployed ultimately aren't owned by IT; they're owned by the business. And having them present in the room, whether that's an IT committee or systems committee or something along those lines, it makes huge progress in terms of having that open communication about the successful outcomes of implementations. Many organizations, we've implemented, fairly similar structures to make sure that there's that feedback loop, not just to line of business, but also to executive management. They have to take, ownership to ensure that, when they've signed the check off to the system, that they're going to be present to make sure that the returns happen too. So accountability is key, and making sure that the right people are accountable is absolutely top of the list.
Okay. So we're getting to the end of our discussion. How about I fire 3 quick questions for you? So one technology every hospitality business should never compromise on.
A system of record for your profiles. Everybody should have a single system of record, to know that you've got that profile in one place, which is accessible to all systems and all people.
Okay. The biggest myth about AI in hospitality right now?
Is that it's seamless and simple to implement. It takes more. It needs structure. It's like any other IT investment, and we have to align our mentality towards that.
Okay. One piece of advice you give an operator or any operator before their next technology investment?
Focus on the business outcome. It has to be. It's foundational. What is it there to do, and how are you going to measure that return?
Kevin, it's been great to have you here today. Sure, a lot of our listeners found the information and your view extremely invaluable to have. Thank you for joining me and talking straight to me and our audience. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. It's an absolute pleasure.
The most important thing I'm taking away from the conversation is not about any particular technology, it's about sequence. The businesses that get this right, that actually see the commercial return from their technology investment, almost always do the same things. They start with the business problem, they build the foundation before the features, they bring the right people in the room very early on into the project, and they define what success look like before they sign anything. Technology should never be the hero of the story. The teams, the guests are the hero. Technology is what enables them to do what they do best so they can work better and smarter and deliver the best guest experience for the guest. The only way it does is if it's chosen well, implemented, and measured honestly. Thank you so much, Kevin Edwards, for joining me today. Generally, one of the most strategically important conversations we have had on this series. Follow Focus on Hospitality on LinkedIn and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss an episode. Until next time, keep talking straight. That's it for this episode of Straight Talking by Focus on Hospitality.